Man and His Becoming According to the Vedanta by Rene, Guenon, read by Christopher Robert Neal Nation. Chapter 6, The Degrees of Individual Manifestation. We must now pass on to consider the different degrees of the manifestation of Atma, regarded as the personality, insofar as this manifestation constitutes human individuality, and it may indeed literally be said to constitute it, since this individuality would enjoy no existence at all if it were separated from its principle. That is to say, from the personality. The expression just used calls, however, for one reservation. By the manifestation of Atma must be understood manifestation referred to Atma as its essential principle, but it must not be inferred from this that Atma manifests itself in some way, since it never enters into manifestation. As we have previously stated, and that is why it is not in any way affected thereby. In other words, Atma is that by which all things are manifested, and which is not itself manifested by anything. And it is this point which must never be lost sight of throughout all that follows. We will repeat once more that Atma and Purusha are one and the same principle, in that it is from Prakriti and not from Purusha that all manifestation is produced. But if the Sankhya, because its point of view is chiefly cosmological, and not strictly speaking metaphysical, sees this manifestation as the development or actualization of the potentialities of Prakriti, the Vedanta necessarily sees it quite differently, because it regards Atma, which is outside any change or becoming, as the true principle to which everything must ultimately be referred. It might be said that, viewed in this manner, the Sankhya and the Vedanta represent, respectively, the points of view of substance and essence, and that the first can be called a cosmological point of view, because it is that of nature and of becoming. But, on the other hand, metaphysics does not limit itself to essence, regarded as the correlative of substance, nor even to being, in which these two terms are unified. It extends much further, since it attains to Paramatma or Purushottama, which is the supreme Brahma, and therefore its point of view, assuming that such an expression is still applicable here, is truly unlimited. Furthermore, when we speak of the different degrees of individual manifestation, it should be readily understood that they correspond with the degrees of universal manifestation by reason of the basic analogy between the macrocosm and the microcosm, to which we have already alluded. This will be still better understood if one remembers that all manifested beings alike are subject to the general conditions which limit the states of existence in which they are placed. If we cannot, when considering any given being, really isolate one state of that being from the whole composed of all the other states among which it is situated hierarchically at any given level, no more can we, from another point of view, isolate that state from all that belongs, not to the same being, but to the same degree of universal existence. And thus all appears linked together in various different ways, both within manifestation itself and also in so far as the latter, forming a single whole in its indefinite multiplicity, is attached to its principle, that is, to being, and through being to the supreme principle. Multiplicity, once it is a possibility, exists according to its own mode. But this mode is illusory in the sense we have already ascribed to that word, that of a lesser reality, because the very existence of this multiplicity is based upon unity, from which it is derived and within which it is principially contained. When viewing the whole of universal manifestation in this manner, we may say that in the very multiplicity of its degrees and of its modes, existence is one, according to a formula borrowed from Islamic esotericism. Furthermore, there is a fine distinction which it is important to note here as between unicity and unity. The first embraces multiplicity as such, while the second is its principle, not its fruit, in the sense in which this word is applied to Prakriti only, but as containing within itself essentially as well as substantially all the possibilities of manifestation. It can therefore correctly be said that being is one, and that it is unity itself. In the metaphysical sense, however, and not in the mathematical sense, for at this stage we have passed quite outside the domain of quantity. Between metaphysical unity and mathematical unity, there is an analogy, but not identity. And similarly, when we speak of the multiplicity of universal manifestation, it is again not with a quantitative multiplicity that we are concerned. For quantity is merely a special condition of certain manifested states. Finally, if being is one, the supreme principle is without duality, as we shall see in what follows. Unity is indeed the first of all determinations, but it is already a determination, and as such, it cannot properly be applied to the supreme principle. Having given these few indispensable explanations, let us return to the consideration of the degrees of manifestation. It is necessary, as we have seen, to draw a distinction first of all between formless and formal manifestation. But when we confine our attention to the individuality, it is always exclusively with the latter that we are concerned. The human state, properly so called, like every other individual state, belongs wholly to formal manifestation, since it is precisely the presence of form among the conditions contributing to make up a particular mode of existence which characterizes that mode as individual. If, therefore, we have to consider a formless element, it will also necessarily be a supra-individual element, and as regards its relationship with human individuality, it must never be considered as constitutive of it, nor for any reason at all as forming a part of it, but as linking the individuality to the personality. The personality indeed is unmanifested, even in so far as it is regarded more especially as the principle of the manifested states, just as being, although it is properly the principle of universal manifestation, remains outside of and beyond that manifestation, as we may recall Aristotle's unmoved mover at this point. On the other hand, formless manifestation is also, in a relative sense, principial in relation to formal manifestation, and thus it establishes a link between the latter and its unmanifested principle, which is, moreover, the common principle of these two orders of manifestation. Similarly, if we distinguish in formal or individual manifestation between the subtle and the gross state, the first is, more relatively still, principial in relation to the second, and hence placed hierarchically between it and formless manifestation. We have therefore, through a series of principles, become progressively more relative and determined, a chain at once logical and ontological, the 2 points of view, moreover, corresponding in such a way that they can only be separated artificially, extending from the unmanifested downward to gross manifestation, passing through the intermediary of formless manifestation and then of subtle manifestation. And whether we are dealing with the macrocosm or with the microcosm, such is the general order which must be followed in the development of the possibilities of manifestation. The elements about which we shall now be speaking are the tattvas enumerated by the Sankhya, with the exception, of course, of the first and the last, that is, of Prakriti and Purusha. We have seen that among these tattvas, some are regarded as productive productions and others as unproductive productions. A question therefore suggests itself in this connection. Is this division equivalent to the division we have just specified in respect of the degrees of manifestation? Is this division equivalent to the division we have just specified in respect of the degrees of manifestation, or does it not at least roughly correspond with it? For example, if we limit ourselves to the point of view of individuality, we might be inclined to refer the tattvas of the first group to the subtle state and those of the second to the gross state. The more so since, in a certain sense, subtle manifestation is productive of gross manifestation, while the latter is not productive of any further state. But the answer is not really quite so simple. In point of fact, in the first group we have buddhi, first of all, which is the formless element to which we were alluding just now. As to the other tattvas, which are included with it, ahankara and tanmatras, they do indeed belong to the domain of subtle manifestation. Again, in the second group, the bhutas incontestably belong to the domain of gross manifestation, since they are the corporal elements. But the manas, not being corporal, must, in itself at least, be referred to subtle manifestation, although its activity is also exercised in relation to gross manifestation. While the other indriyas have in some sort a twofold aspect, being conceivable at the same time as faculties and as organs. Psychically as well as corporally, therefore, which is also to say both in the subtle and in the gross state. It must, moreover, be clearly understood that that part of subtle manifestation which is taken into consideration in all these circumstances is really only the portion affecting the human individual state in its extra corporal modalities, and superior as these may be to the corporal modality, inasmuch as they contain its immediate principle, their domain extending at the same time much further. Nevertheless, if we situate them in the totality of universal existence, they still belong to that degree of existence in which the human state as a whole is situated. The same remark also applies when we say that subtle manifestation is productive of gross manifestation. For this to be strictly accurate, however, it is necessary, in the case of the former, to apply the restriction we have just mentioned, since the same relationship cannot be established in respect of those other states which, though likewise individual states, are not human states, and therefore differ entirely as to their conditions, other than the condition imposed by the presence of form. For those states we must nevertheless also be included in subtle manifestation. As we have already explained, from the moment that we accept the human individuality as a term of comparison, and we must inevitably do, while clearly bearing in mind that the human individual state is really neither more nor less important than any other state whatsoever. One last observation is called for. In speaking of the order of development of the possibilities of manifestation, or of the order in which the elements corresponding to the different phases of this development should be enumerated, great care must be taken to explain that such an order implies a purely logical succession, signifying, however, a real ontological connection, and that there cannot be any question at all here of a temporal succession. Development in time, indeed, only corresponds with a special condition of existence, which is one of those conditions defining the domain in which the human state is contained. And there is an indefinite number of other modes of development equally possible, and included also within universal manifestation. Human individuality cannot therefore be related to cannot therefore be related in the order of time to other states of the being, since these, in a general way, are extra-temporal. And that is also true even when it is only a question of states, which likewise belong to formal manifestation. It might further be added that certain extensions of the human individuality outside its corporal modality are already freed from time, without on that account being exempt from the general conditions of the state to which this individuality belongs. These extensions are really situated in mere prolongations of that state, and we shall doubtless have occasion in other studies to explain just how such prolongations may be reached through the suppression of one or other of the conditions which together contribute to make up the corporal world. Such being the case, it is all the more apparent that there cannot be any question of the temporal condition applying outside this same state, nor consequently of its governing the relation of the integral human state with other states. And this is even less admissible when it is a question of a principle common to all the states of manifestation, or of an element which, though indeed manifested, is nevertheless superior to all formal manifestation, as is the element to be considered next. May 10th, 2018, Ascension Day. Man and His Becoming, According to the Vedanta, by Rene, Guenon. Read by Christopher Robert Neal Nation. Chapter 7, Buddhi, or the Higher Intellect. The first degree of the manifestation of Atma, taking this expression in the sense explained in the last chapter, is the higher intellect, Buddhi, which, as we have seen above, is also called Mahat, or the Great Principle. It is the second of the 25 principles of Sankhya, and the first, therefore, of all the productions of Prakriti. This principle still pertains to the universal order, since it is formless. We must not, however, forget that it already belongs to manifestation, and therefore proceeds from Prakriti. For all manifestation, at whatever degree we take it, necessarily implies the two correlative and complementary terms, Purusha and Prakriti, essence and substance. It is nonetheless true that Buddhi transcends the domain not only of human individuality, but of every individual state whatsoever. And it is this which justifies its other name of Mahat. It is never really individualized. Therefore, and it is not until the next stage, that of the particular, or rather particularist, consciousness of the ego, that we shall find individuality realized. Buddhi, considered in relation to the human individuality, or to any other individual state, is then its immediate but transcendent principle, just as, from the point of view of universal existence, formless manifestation is the principle of formal manifestation. And it is at the same time what may be called the expression of the personality in manifestation. Therefore, that which unifies the being throughout the indefinite multiplicity of its individual states. The human state, in its utmost extension, being but one state among all the rest. In other words, if we view the self, Atma, or personality, as the spiritual sun which shines at the center of the entire being, Buddhi will be the ray directly emanating from this sun and illuminating in its entirety the particular individual state that more especially concerns us. Note 1. As to the sense in which this expression, spiritual sun, should be taken, we would refer the reader to the remark previously made concerning the universal spirit. While at the same time linking it to the other individual states of the same being, or rather, more generally still, to all the manifested states, individual or non-individual, of that being, and beyond these, to the center itself. Further, it should be remarked, without however going into the question so far as to interrupt the course of our exposition, that, owing to the fundamental unity of the being in all its states, the center of each state where this spiritual ray is projected should be regarded as virtually, if not effectively, identified with the center of the entire being, and it is for this reason that any state whatsoever, the human state, as well as any other, can be taken as a basis for the realization of the supreme identity. It is precisely in this sense, and in virtue of this identification, that one may say, as we did in the first place, that Purusha itself dwells at the center of the human individuality. That is to say, at the point where the intersection of the spiritual ray with the realm of the vital possibilities determines the living soul, Jivatma. Note 2. Clearly, we are not referring in this instance to a mathematical point, but to what might by analogy be called a metaphysical point. Always with the proviso, however, that such an expression must not be allowed to evoke the notion of the monad, as the monad of Leibniz, since Jivatma is nothing more than a particular and contingent manifestation of Atma, so that its separate existence is really illusory. The geometrical symbolism referred to will, however, be set forth in a separate work, together with all the developments to which it lends itself. Furthermore, Buddhi, like everything that proceeds from the potentialities of Prakriti, participates in the three gunas. That explains why, when viewed from the standpoint of distinctive knowledge, it is regarded as ternary, and in the sphere of universal existence, it is then identified with the divine Trimurti. Mahat is conceived distinctively as three gods, in the sense of three aspects of the intelligible light. For this is the real meaning of the Sanskrit word deva, of which the Latin word deus, moreover, etymologically, the exact equivalent. Note 3. Were one to give the word God the meaning that it has subsequently assumed in Western languages, its use in the plural would make nonsense from the Hindu just as much as from the Christian or Islamic point of view, since, as we pointed out before, it could then only apply to Ishvara exclusively in his indivisible unity, which is that of universal being. Whatever multiplicity of aspects can be considered as pertaining to it in a secondary way. Through the influence of the three gunas, being one single manifestation, murti, and three gods, in the universal order, it is the divinity Ishvara, not in himself, but under his three principal aspects as Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, constituting the Trimurti or triple manifestation. But regarded distributively under the aspect of separativity, which is, moreover, purely contingent, it belongs, without however being itself individualized, to individual beings, to whom it communicates the possibility of participating in the divine attributes. That is to say, in the very nature of universal being, the principle of all existence. Note 4. Matsya Purana. It will be noticed that Buddhi is not unrelated to the Logos of the Alexandrians. It is easy to see that Buddhi, Logos, is here considered in its respective relations with the first two of the three Purushas, which are spoken of in the Bhagavad Gita. In the macrocosmic order, the immutable Purusha is Ishvara himself, of whom the Trimurti is the expression in manifested mode. We are speaking, of course, of formless manifestation, for there is nothing individual about it. And it is stated that the other Purusha is disseminated among all beings. Similarly, in the microcosmic order, Buddhi, Logos, may be viewed relatively to the personality, Atma, and relatively to the living soul, Jivatma. The latter, moreover, only being the reflection of the personality in the individual human state, a reflection which could not exist without the meditation of Buddhi. To recall here the symbol of the sun and its reflected image in the water, Buddhi, Logos, is, as we have stated, the ray which determines the formation of the image and at the same time unites it with its luminous source. It is in virtue of the twofold relationship which has just been indicated and of this function of intermediary between the personality and the individuality that we may regard the intellect, in spite of the inevitable inadequacy of such a way of speaking, as passing in some sort from the state of universal potentiality to the individualized state, but without really ceasing to be such as it was, since this apparent passage only comes about through its intersection with the particular domain constituted by certain conditions of existence, defining the individuality in question. It then produces, as a resultant of this intersection, the individual consciousness, ahankara, implied in the living soul, jivatma, in which it is inherent. As we have already pointed out, this consciousness, which is the third principle of the Sankhya, gives rise to the notion of the ego, aham, whence the name ahankara, literally that which makes me, since its proper function is to establish the individual conviction, abhimana, that is to say, precisely the notion that I am is concerned with external, bahya, and internal, abhyantara, objects, which are respectively the objects of perception and contemplation. and the sum total of these objects is described by the term idam, this, which conceived as in opposition to aham, or me, a purely relative opposition. However, and for that reason quite different from that which modern philosophers claim to establish between subject and object, or between mind and thing, thus the individual consciousness proceeds directly, but simply as a conditioned modality, from the intellectual principle, and in its turn produces all the other principles or elements specifically attaching to the human individuality. These
Man and
elements
his
we shall
becoming,
now consider
according to the
detail.
Vedanta, by Rene, Guenon, read by Christopher Robert Neal Nation. Chapter 8, Manas, or the inward sense, the 10 external faculties of sensation and action. In its list of the tattvas, after individual consciousness, ahankara, the Sankhya goes on to describe the 5 tanmatras, subtle elementary determinations, incorporeal, therefore, and outwardly imperceptible, belonging to the same group of productive productions. In an immediate sense, they constitute, respectively, the principles of the 5 bhutas, or corporal and sensible elements, and receive their finite expression in the particular conditions of individual existence, prevailing at the level of the human state. The word tanmatra literally means an assignment. Matra, measure, determination, delimiting the proper sphere of a given quality. Tad, or thought, neuter pronoun, that taken here in the sense of quiddity, like in the Arabic that. Note 1. It should be noted that these words, tat and that, are phonetically equivalent to one another, as also to the English that, which bears the same meaning. That taken here in the sense of quiddity and universal existence. But this is not the place to enter into fuller detail on this subject. We will merely remark that the 5 tanmatras are usually indicated by the names of the sensible qualities: auditive or sonorous, tangible, visible with the double sense of form and color, sapid, and olfactory. But these qualities must be looked upon here as existing in a relatively principial and non-developed state. Only, since it is through the bhutas alone that they will be actually manifested in the sensible order. Furthermore, the relation of the tanmatras to the bhutas is analogous. It in its relative degree
to that of essence to substance, so that the term elementary essences could be applied accurately enough to the tan matras. Note 2. It is in a sense quite similar to the conception of the tan matras that Fabre de Olivet, in his interpretation of Genesis, the Hebraic tongue restored, makes use of the expression intelligible elementization. The five Bhutas, in the order of their production or of their manifestation, in order parallel to that just indicated for the tan matras, since a corresponding sensible quality goes with each element, are ether, akasha, air, vayu, fire, dehas, water, ap, and earth, prithvi or prithvi, and again, ether, air, fire, water, and earth. And it is from these that the whole of gross or corporal manifestation is made up. Between the tan mantras and the bhutas, and constituting, along with the latter, the group of unproductive productions, there are 11 distinct and specifically individual faculties which proceed from ahankara and which at the same time all participate in the five tan matras. Of the 11 faculties in question, 10 are external, 5 of sensation, and 5 of action. The 11th, which is concerned with both these functions, is the inward sense or mental faculty, manas, and this is directly attached to consciousness. It is to manas that we must refer individual thought, which belongs to the former order, and which includes reason as well as memory and imagination. Note 4. This was doubtless Aristotle's meaning when he said that man, as an individual, never thinks without images, that is to say, without forms. It is in no way inherent to the transcendent intellect, buddhi, the attributes of which are essentially formless. It is worth remarking in this connection that, for Aristotle also, pure intellect is of a transcendent order and can claim knowledge of universal principles as its proper object. This knowledge, which is not discursive in any respect, is acquired directly and immediately by intellectual intuition. To avoid any misunderstanding, it should be added that this intuition has nothing at all to do with the so-called intuition of a merely sensitive and vital order, which plays such a prominent part in the decidedly anti-metaphysical theories of certain contemporary philosophers. As for the development of the different faculties of individual man, it is enough to quote the teaching of the Brahma Sutras on this subject. The intellect, the inward sense, and also the faculties of sensation and action are developed in manifestation and reabsorbed into the unmanifested in a similar sequence, except that reabsorption proceeds in an inverse order to that of development. And this sequence always follows that of the elements from which these faculties proceed as regards their constitution, with the exception, however, of the intellect, which is developed in the formless order prior to the determination of any formal or properly individual principle. As to Purusha, or Atma, its emanation, insofar as it is regarded as the personality of a being, is not a birth, even in the widest meaning of the word. Note 7. It is possible, in fact, to apply the name of birth or death to the beginning and end of any cycle whatsoever. That is to say, of an existence in whatever state of manifestation, and not in the human state alone, as will be explained further on. The passage from one state to another is then both a death and a birth, according as it is taken in relation to the antecedent to the subsequent state. Neither is it a production, implying a starting point for its actual existence, as is the case for everything that proceeds from Prakriti. One cannot in fact assign to it any limitation by any particular condition of existence, since, being identified with the Supreme Brahma, it partakes of an infinite essence. Note 8. The word essence, when it is thus applied analogically, ceases to be in any way a correlative of substance. Besides, whatever possesses a correlative of any kind cannot be infinite. Similarly, the word nature, when applied to the universal being, or even beyond being, loses its usual and etymological meaning entirely, together with the idea of becoming, which is implied in it, implying the possession of the divine attributes, at least virtually and even actually, insofar as this participation is effectively realized in the supreme identity, not to speak of all that lies beyond any attribution whatsoever, since here we are contemplating the supreme Brahma, which is nirguna, and not merely Brahma as saguna, that is to say, Ishvara. Note 9. The possession of the divine attributes is called in Sanskrit Aishwarya, as constituting a real co-naturality with Ishvara. It is active, but only in principle, therefore actionless. Note 10. Aristotle was right in also stressing the point that the prime mover of all things, or the principle of movement, must itself be motionless, which amounts to saying, in other words, that the principle of all action must be actionless. For this activity is not essential to it nor inherent in it, but is simply eventual and contingent, merely relative to its states of manifestation. As the carpenter, grasping in his hand his axe and his other tools, and then laying them aside, enjoys tranquility and repose. So this Atma, in its union with its instruments, by means of which its principal faculties are expressed and developed in each of its states of manifestation, and which are thus nothing but the manifestations of these faculties with their respective organs, is active, although this activity in no way affects its inmost nature, and in relinquishing them enjoys repose and tranquility, in the inaction from which in itself it never departed. The various faculties of sensation and action are 11 in number. 5 of sensation, means or instruments of knowledge in their own particular sphere. 5 of action, in the inward sense, manas. Where a greater number, 13, is given, the term indriya is employed in its widest and most comprehensive sense, distinguishing within manas by reason of the plurality of its functions. The intellect, not in itself and in so far as it belongs to the transcendent order, but as a particular determination relative to the individual. The individual consciousness, from which manas cannot be separated, and the inward sense properly so called, what the scholastic philosophers term sensorium commune, where a lesser number, usually 7, is given, the same term is applied in a more restricted manner. Thus, 7 sensible organs are specified: the 2 eyes, the 2 ears, the 2 nostrils, and the mouth or tongue. So that in this case we are dealing merely with the 7 openings or orifices of the head. The 11 faculties mentioned above, although indicated collectively by the term prana, are not, as are the 5 vayus, of which we shall speak later. They are not simple modifications of the mukhya prana, our principal vital act, respiration, with the assimilation ensuing from it, but distinct principles from the special point of view of the human individuality. The term prana, in its most usual acceptation, really means vital breath, but in certain Vedic texts it serves to describe something which, in the universal sense, is identified in principle with Brahma itself, as when it is said that in deep sleep all the faculties are reabsorbed into prana, since while a man sleeps without dreaming, his spiritual principle, Atma, viewed in relation to him, is one with Brahma. This state being beyond distinction, and therefore truly supra-individual. That is why the word svapiti, he sleeps, is interpreted as swam apito bhavati. He has entered into his own self. As to the word indriya, it really means power, which is also the primary meaning of the word faculty. But by extension, it comes to mean, as has already been pointed out, both the faculty and its bodily organ, which are thus described by one and the same word, and which are considered as constituting in combination a single instrument, either of knowledge, buddhi, or jnana, these terms being here taken in their widest sense, or of action, karma. The five instruments of sensation are the ears or hearing, the skin or touch, the eyes or sight, the tongue or taste, the nose or smell, being enumerated thus in the order of development of the senses, which is that of the corresponding elements. But to explain this correspondence in detail, it would be necessary to discuss fully the conditions of corporal existence, which we cannot undertake to do here. The five instruments of action are the organs of excretion, the generative organs, the hands, the feet, and lastly, the voice or organ of speech. Which is reckoned as the 10th. Manas must be regarded as the 11th, fulfilling in its own nature a double function of service both toward perception and toward action, and partaking in consequence of the proprieties of and partaking in consequence of the properties of each, which it centralizes to a certain extent within itself. According to the Sankhya, these faculties with their respective organs are, distinguishing three faculties in Manas, the 13 instruments of knowledge in the sphere of human individuality. For the end of action is not in action itself, but only insofar as it relates to knowledge. 3 are internal and 10 external, compared to 3 sentinels and 10 gates. Consciousness being inherent in the former, but not in the latter when viewed distinctly. A bodily sense perceives, and an organ of action executes, the one being, as it were, an entry, and the other an outgoing. There are here two successive and complementary phrases. There are here two successive and complementary phases, of which the first is a centripetal and the second a centrifugal motion. Between the two, the inward sense, manas, examines. Consciousness makes the individual application, that is to say, the assimilation of the perception by the ego, of which it henceforth becomes part as a secondary modification. And finally, the pure
Man
intellect,
and His Becoming,
buddhi,
according to the
logos,
Vedanta,
transposes
Rene,
the
Guenon,
data of the
read by
preceding
Christopher
faculty
Robert
into
Neal,
the
Nation.
universal.
Chapter 9, Envelopes of the Self, the 5 Vayus, or vital functions. Purusha, or Atma, manifesting itself as Jivatma, is the living form of the individual being. In the living form of the individual being is regarded, according to the Vedanta,
as clothing itself in a series of envelopes or successive vehicles, representing so many phases of its manifestation. It would be altogether wrong, however, to compare these envelopes to bodies, since it is the last phase only that belongs to the corporal order. It is important to note, moreover, that Atma cannot, strictly speaking, be said to be actually contained within such envelopes, since, by its very nature, it is not susceptible to any limitations and is in no way conditioned by any state of manifestation whatsoever. Note 1. In Taittiriya Upanishad 11.8.1 and 111.10.5, the designations of the various envelopes are referred directly to the self, according as it is considered in relation to this or that state of manifestation. The first envelope, Ana Maya Kosha, the suffix Maya signifying made of or consisting of whatever is denoted by the word to which it is joined. The first envelope is none other than the totality of the possibilities of manifestation, which Atma comprises within itself, in its permanent actuality, in the principial and undifferentiated state. It is called made of beatitude, Ananda, because the self, in this primordial state, enjoys the plenitude of its own being, and it is in no way really distinct from the self. It is superior to conditioned existence, which presupposes it, and it is situated at the level of pure being. That is why it is regarded as characteristic of Ishvara. Note 2. Whereas the other designations, those of the four following envelopes, can be considered as applicable to Jivatma. The envelope called Anandamaya applies not only to Ishvara, but also, by transposition, even to Perimatma, or the Supreme Brahma. And that is why it is said in the Taittiriya Upanishad 11.5.1, differing from that which consists of distinctive knowledge is the other interior self, which consists of bliss, Anandamaya. Here, therefore, we are in the formless order. It is only when this envelope is viewed in relation to formal manifestation, and in so far as the principle of the latter is contained in it, that it can be said to represent principial or causal form, that by which form will be manifested and actualized in the succeeding stages. The second envelope is formed by the directly reflected light, in the intelligible sense, of integral and universal knowledge. Note 3. The Sanskrit word jnana has the self-same root as the Greek, which is also shares with the Latin cognoscere. It expresses an idea of production or generation, because the being becomes whatever it knows and realizes itself through that knowledge. It is composed of five elementary essences, conceivable but not perceptible in their subtle state, and it arises out of the conjunction of the higher intellect, buddhi, with the principal faculties of perception proceeding respectively from the five tan mantras, and the external development of which constitutes the five senses of the corporal individuality. Note 4. It is starting from this second envelope that the term sharira properly applies, especially if this word, as interpreted by the methods of Nirukta, be given the sense of dependent upon the six principles, that is to say, upon buddhi or upon ahankara, which is derived directly from it and is the first principle in the individual order, and the five tan matras. The third envelope, in which the constituents of the preceding envelope are linked up with the inward sense, manas, especially brings into play the mental consciousness. Note 5. By this expression, we mean something representing a more advanced degree of determination than individual consciousness, pure and simple. It might be said to be the resultant of the union of manas and ahankara. Especially brings into play the mental consciousness or thinking faculty. This, as we have previously explained, belongs exclusively to the individual and formal order, and its development arises from the radiation and reflective mode of the higher intellect within a determinate individual state, which is in this case the human state. The fourth envelope comprises the faculties which proceed from the vital breath, prana. That is to say, the five vayus, modalities of this prana, as well as the faculties of action and sensation. These last already existing principially in the two preceding envelopes as purely conceptive faculties, at which stage, indeed, there could be no question of any sort of action, any more than any external perception. The combination of these last envelopes constitutes the subtle form, as opposed to the gross or corporal form. Thus we meet again here with the distinction between the two modes of formal manifestation, which we have referred to on several previous occasions. The five vital functions or actions are called vayus, although they are not strictly speaking air or wind, which is the general meaning of the word vayu and vata, derived from the root va, to go, to move, and usually denoting the element air, one of the characteristic properties of which is mobility. Since they belong to the subtle and not to the corporal state, as we have said above, they are modalities of the vital breath. Prana, or more generally, ana. Note 7. The root an occurs again, with similar meaning in the Greek, breath, or wind, and in the Latin, anima, soul, the original and proper meaning of which is precisely vital breath. The vital breath considered chiefly in relation to respiration. They are 1. Aspiration, that is, respiration regarded as ascending in its initial phase, prana in the strictest sense of this word, and attracting the still unindividualized elements of the cosmic environment, causing them to participate by assimilation in the individual consciousness. 2. Inspiration, considered as descending in a succeeding phase, whereby these elements penetrate into the individuality. 3. A phase intermediary between the two preceding ones, Vijnana, consisting on the one hand of all the reciprocal actions and reactions which are produced upon the contact of the individual with the surrounding elements, and on the other hand, the various resultant vital movements of which the circulation of the blood is the corresponding movement in bodily organism. 4. Expiration, Udana, which projects the breath while transforming it beyond the limits of the restricted individuality. That is, the individuality reduced simply to those modalities which are commonly developed in all men, into the sphere of the possibilities of the extended individuality viewed in its integrality. Note 8. It should be observed that the word expire means both to eject the breath in respiration and to die, in respect of the bodily part of the human individuality. Both these meanings are related to the Udana in question. And 5. Digestion, or inner substantial assimilation, by which the elements absorbed become an integral part of the individuality. It is clearly stated that all this is not purely a matter of the operation of one or of several bodily organs. It is, in fact, easy to realize that it refers not merely to the analogically corresponding physiological functions, but rather to vital assimilation in the widest possible sense. The corporal or gross form is the fifth and last envelope, the one which, for the human state, corresponds to the most external mode of manifestation. It is the elementary envelope, composed of the 5 sensible elements, out of which all bodies are constituted. It assimilates to itself the combined elements received in nutriment. Ana, a word derived from the verbal root ad, to eat. Secreting the finer parts which remain in the organic circulation, and excreting or rejecting the coarser, accepting those, however, which are deposited in the bones. As a result of this assimilation, the earthy substances become the flesh, the watery substances the blood, and the igneous substances the fat, the marrow and nervous system, phosphoric matter. For there are corporal substances in which the nature of one element or another predominates, although they are all formed by the union of the 5 elements. Every organic being dwelling in such a bodily form possesses in a more or less complete degree of development the 11 individual faculties of which we have spoken above, and, as we have also seen, These faculties are manifested in the bodily organism by means of the 11 corresponding organs. Aveyas, a name which is also applied in the subtle state, but only by analogy with the gross state. According to Shankaracharya, note 12, the latter text, besides the three classes of living beings mentioned in the others, mentions a fourth class, namely those born of damp heat. But this class can be linked on to the seed-born class. According to Shankaracharya, three classes of organic beings may be distinguished according to their mode of reproduction. The viviparas, such as man and other mammals. 2. The oviparos, such as birds, reptiles, fish, and insects. And 3. The germiniparos, which includes both the lower animals and plants, the former mobile, being born chiefly in water, while the latter, which are immobile, are usually born in the earth. However, according to sundry passages in the Veda, nutriment, anna, that is to say, vegetation, also proceeds from water, since it is rain which fertilizes the earth. Note 13. Vegetables are the essence, rasa, of water. Anna arises or proceeds from varsha. The word rasa literally means sap, and it has been seen earlier on that it also signifies taste or savor. Moreover, in French, also the word seve and saveur, like the corresponding English words, have the same root, sap, which is at the same time that of the Latin sapere, French savoir, by reason of the analogy which exists between nutritive assimilation in the bodily order and cognitive assimilation in the mental and intellectual orders. It should also be noted that the word ana sometimes refers to the element earth itself, which is the last in the order of development, and which is also derived from the element water, which immediately precedes it. Man and His Becoming, according to the Vedanta, by Rene, Guenon, read by Christopher Robert Neal Nation. Chapter 10. Essential unity and identity of the self in all the states of the being. At this stage, we need to emphasize a point of fundamental importance. All the principles or elements we have been speaking about, which are described as distinct, are indeed so when viewed from the individual standpoint, but only from that standpoint, for in reality they merely constitute so many manifested modalities of the universal spirit. In other words, although accidental and contingent insofar as they are manifested, they serve as the expression of certain essential possibilities of Atma, those which from their very nature are possibilities of manifestation. And these possibilities, in principle and in their basic reality, are in no wise distinct from Atma. This is why they must be considered in the universal, and no longer in relation to individual beings, as being in reality Brahma itself, which is without duality. and outside of which there is nothing, either manifested or unmanifested. Note 1. Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, in his treatise on unity, Risalat al-Ahadiyya, says in the same sense, Allah, may He be exalted, is exempt from all comparison as well as from every rival, contrast, or opposition. There is moreover perfect agreement in this respect between the Vedanta and Islamic esotericism. Besides, anything which leaves something outside itself cannot be infinite, being limited by that very thing which it excludes. And thus the world, taking this expression as meaning the whole of universal manifestation, is only distinguishable from Brahma in an illusory manner, while on the contrary, Brahma is absolutely distinct from that which it pervades. That is, from the world, since we cannot apply any of the determinative attributes to it which pertain to the world, and since universal manifestation in its entirety is rigorously nil in relation to its infinity. As we have already pointed out elsewhere, this irreciprocity of relationship entails the formal condemnation of pantheism as well as immanentism of any sort, and the Bhagavad Gita also asserts the same thing very clearly in the following terms: all beings are in me, and I am not myself in them. My being upholds beings, and without being itself in them, it is through it that they exist. Again, one may say that Brahma is the absolute whole for the very reason that it is infinite, while on the other hand, though all things are in Brahma, they are not Brahma. When viewed from the standpoint of distinction, that is to say, in their quality of relative and conditioned things, their existence as such being moreover nothing but an illusion from the standpoint of supreme reality. That which is asserted of things and which cannot apply to Brahma is but an expression of relativity, and at the same time, this relativity being illusory, all distinction is equally illusory, because one of its terms vanishes when brought into the presence of the other, nothing being capable of entering into correlation with the infinite. It is solely in principle that all things are Brahma, but also it is in that alone which constitutes their fundamental reality. That this it is that must never be lost sight of, or if there is to be a proper understanding of what is to follow. It is solely in principle that all things are Brahma, but also it is that alone which constitutes their fundamental reality. This it is that must never be lost sight of if if there is to be a proper understanding of what is to follow. Note 4. We will here quote a Taoist text in which the same ideas are expressed. Do not inquire, rather, do not inquire whether the principle is in this or in that. It is in all beings. That is why it is given the epithet of great, supreme, entire, universal, total. That which caused being to be being is not itself subject to the same laws as being. That which caused all beings to be limited is itself limitless, infinite. As for manifestation, the principle produces the succession of its phases, but is not that succession, nor involved in that succession. It is the author of causes and of effects, the prime cause, but is not the cause and effects, particular and manifested. It is the author of condensations and dissipations, births and deaths, changes of state, but is not itself condensation or dissipation. Everything proceeds from it, and is modified by and under its influence. It is in all beings, but it is in all beings by the determining of a norm, but it is not identical with beings, being neither differentiated or limited. Thus, the spider spins its web out of its own substance. Subtle beings take diverse incorporeal forms, and the lotus grows from marsh to marsh without organs of locomotion. That Brahma is indivisible and without parts, as it is no objection to this conception of universal multiplicity in its unity, or rather in its non duality. It is not its totality, eternally immutable. It is not its totality, eternally immutable, which is modified in the appearances of the world, nor any of its parts, since it has none, but it is itself, viewed under the special aspect of distinction or of differentiation, that is, as saguna or saveshisha, and if it can be viewed thus, that is because it comprises all possibilities within itself, without there being in any sense parts of itself. Note 9. In Islamic esotericism also, unity, tawheed, considered insofar as it contains all aspects of divinity, Asra Rabbina, or dominical mysteries. Unity is the reverberating surface of the Absolute, with its innumerable facets, which magnifies every creature that is mirrored directly in it. This surface is likewise Maya, taken in its highest sense as the Shakti of Brahma, that is to say, the omnipotence of the Supreme Principle. Again, in an exactly similar way, in the Jewish Kabbalah, Keter, the first of the 10 Sephirot, is the garment of Ein Sof, the infinite or the absolute. Diverse changes of condition and modes of existence are presented to the same individual soul while dreaming, and in this state perceiving internal objects which belong to the domain of subtle manifestation. Note 10. The modifications produced in a dream offer one of the most striking analogies that it is possible to put forward in illustration of the multiplicity of the states of the being. We shall therefore have occasion to speak of it again if, as we intend, we one day set forth this metaphysical theory more completely. Diverse illusory forms corresponding diverse changes of condition and modes of existence are presented to the same individual soul while dreaming, and in this state perceiving internal objects which belong to the domain of subtle manifestation. Diverse illusory forms corresponding to different modalities of formal manifestation other than the corporal modality are assumed by this same subtle being without in any respect altering its unity. Such illusory forms, Maya Avirupa, being considered as purely accidental and not belonging of themselves to the being who assumes them, so that the latter must be regarded as unaffected by this merely apparent modification. Note 11. In connection with this point, an interesting comparison can be made with the teaching of Catholic theologians, and especially of St. Thomas Aquinas, on the subject of the forms that angels are able to assume. The similarity is all the more remarkable in that the points of view are naturally very different. We will likewise recall in passing what we have already had occasion to point out elsewhere, namely that almost everything that is said theologically of the angels can also be said metaphysically of the higher states of the being. Brahma is almighty, since it contains all things in principle, capable of every activity, although actionless, or rather, on that very account, without organ or instrument of action of any sort. Therefore, no motive or special end, such as pertains to an individual act, other than its own will, which is indistinguishable from its omnipotence. Note 11. It is its Shakti, which we have spoken of in previous footnotes, and it is also itself insofar as it is considered as universal possibility. Moreover, in itself, the Shakti can only be an aspect of the principle, and if it is distinguished from the principle in order to be separatively considered, it is then nothing but the great illusion, Maha Moha. That is to say, Maya in its inferior and exclusively cosmic sense. Without organ or instrument of action of any sort, therefore no motive or special end, other than its own will, must be assigned to the determination of the universe. No accidental differentiation must be imputed to it, as in the case of a particular cause, because each individual being is modified while developing its possibilities in conformity with its own nature. Note 13. This is precisely the idea of Dharma, conceived as conformity to the essential nature of beings, applied to the entire order of universal existence. Thus, the rain cloud distributes rain with impartiality, without regard to the special results which arise from secondary circumstances. And this same fertilizing rain causes different seeds to grow in various ways, producing a variety of plants according to their species, by reason of the different potentialities proper to these seeds respectively. Note 14. O Principle, thou who bestowest on all beings that which befits them, thou hast never claimed to be called equitable, though thou whose benefits extend to all times, thou hast never claimed to be called charitable. Thou who wast before the beginning, and who dost not claim to be called venerable, thou who enfoldest and supportest the universe, producing all its forms, without claiming to be called skillful, it is in thee that I move. Chuanzu, chapter 6, Father Villers, French translation, page 261. Every attribute of a first cause in principle in Brahma. Every attribute of a first cause is in principle in Brahma, which in itself is nevertheless devoid of every distinct quality. That which was, that which is, and that which will be, truly all, is Omkara, the universe principially identified with Brahma, and as such symbolized by the sacred monosyllable Om, and all else which is not subjected to threefold time. Trikala, that is to say, the temporal condition viewed under its three modalities of past, present, and future, is also truly Umkara. Umkara. Assuredly, this Atma, of which all things are but the manifestation, is Brahma. And this Atma, relatively to the various states of the being, has four conditions. Padas, a word signifying literally feet. In truth, all this is Brahma. All this, as moreover the continuation of this latter text, which we shall give later on, clearly shows, must be understood as referring to the different modalities of the individual being regarded in its integrality, as well as to the non-individual states of the total being. That is what is meant here by the conditions of Atma, although in itself Atma is truly unconditioned and never ceases to be so.